Today we have a Star Wars guest and someone who's done a lot of stuff in video games. We have Wilbert Roget II, who's an award-winning composer in the video game industry. Originally, he started in LucasArts as a staff composer in 2008, where he scored and did the musical editing and so on with several Star Wars games, including The Force Unleashed 1 and 2. And then he got his main big start with Star Wars The Old Republic, and he worked on the canceled Star Wars game, Star Wars First Assault. Later, he became a freelance writer for games such as Guild Wars 2 Path of Fire, Lara Croft and the Temple of Osiris, Dead Island 2, A New the Distant Light, and lots of other indie and AAA titles. He has also earned several awards and nominations from the Game Audio Network Guild and the Academy of Interactive Arts and Sciences, the DICE Awards, as well as others. He has also co-founded Impact Soundworks, which is a successful music software company, and is an accomplished lecturer on game music, giving talks at the Game Developers Conference, San Francisco Conservatory of Arts, Yale University, and other institutions. He frequently gives online masterclasses and tutorials on music composition and production, and has a passion for teaching the craft. Inspired at an early age by classic video game soundtracks, Roget specializes in writing music that employs memorable themes developed throughout the score in a traditional fashion. He balances modern production with classic construction, creating fresh and contemporary soundscapes as well as nuanced orchestrations. Wilbert studied music at Yale University, is originally from Philadelphia, and currently resides in Seattle. He is an avid multi-instrumentalist, performing solo flute, keyboards, accordion, and guitar in many of his scores. And most recently, the score which brings him here today is the score for the newest Call of Duty game, Call of Duty World War II. So without further ado, let's welcome to the show our fantastic guest, composer Wilbert Roget II.
I'm just going to say right off the bat, World War II is something musically that's been done a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Some, consider it kind of tired or overdone. There's been so much music from so many different composers. So how did you approach World War II musically to make it fresh, your own, and not something that feels like it's been done before?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, especially considering that, Call of Duty has been around for so long, and this is where it started. My approach was different in that, and this kind of goes along with the game itself, like the main principle is that we didn't go for a big kind of epic sound. Like you listen to pretty much any other Call of Duty game, and, it's fantastic soundtracks by, some of the top composers in Hollywood and in games, but it's usually going for a much larger, kind of affect. It's usually going for this sort of big, bold, epic sound. And what we realize is that, our game isn't really telling that story. Our game is telling the story of just a single platoon full of normal people. Everything that we're doing in game is reinforcing this. Like, there's no regenerating health. You're not doing any crazy superhero stuff. You don't have the greatest technology. You're just normal soldiers. And so we basically just said, well, what would be the purpose of doing something that's so over the top and bombastic that, you kind of lose touch with the characters? And the other side of that is that we wanted it also to not sound like a period piece. We needed to differentiate ourselves, not just from, of course, Michael Giacchino's fantastic original score to Call of Duty, but also just from the idea of, this is just some story that happened way, way back in the day, and, this is like a museum of music or something. But instead, we wanted to say, no, this is happening right now. You are there, and these are real people. So we had to figure out where we were on sort of a continuum between conveying the setting and being contemporary and relatable. And so as a result, we just figured out for every single track, what elements could we bring into it that would be sort of fresh and new and different. For me, the way I kind of structured it was that in addition to having quite a sort of melodic approach, there's quite a lot of themes melodically within the score that you can hear. For example, the Allies theme, the Axis theme, and then there's some location themes as well. And then this idea of the theme of the Call of Duty, which is represented in the second half of the main theme piece, A Brotherhood of Heroes. But in addition to that, we did quite a contemporary kind of modern and even perhaps sort of Hans Zimmerish idea of having these signature sounds in the score that weren't really thematic, but they were just these ideas of sound that would recur in almost every piece in the game. So there were two of them. One of them I would call the Haze of War. And this is this idea of kind of matching the color palette of the game. Like it has this very filmic, sort of desaturated, almost like a metallic blue tint to a lot of the scenes. And, film grain and vignette, all these great, post effects. And I said, well, why don't I match that in the music as well? It doesn't have that super clean and sleek feel as, the modern and futuristic warfare Call of Duty games have, but it has this sort of vintage idea. And so what I did was I had a lot of sounds, things within the orchestra and also synthesized sounds and electric guitar sounds and even this idea called musique concrète. And these sounds kind of conveyed that sort of haze and grit and darkness and imprecision that I thought would underscore that sort of visual art direction as best as possible. The most common and most significant being those musique concrète ideas where I would take sounds of World War II vehicles and artillery and weapons and use them within the score itself. Orchestral percussion instruments like mallets or snare drums, I would actually use, things like steam trains and tank noises and explosion debris and those kinds of sounds. And I would just manipulate them so that they would work with the orchestra. And this is what kind of gave it that hazy and imprecise type feel. I also did a lot with the orchestra as well. A lot of sort of 20th century techniques influenced by 20th century modernist composers that would kind of give this sort of hazy and almost like a radio static sort of feel. Like there's a couple moments in the score where I asked the players in the string section, here's a note, it's a sustaining, but we don't want you to just play it as normal. We want to play it, without any kind of vibrato. We want some people to just dig in and play with a technique called overpressure, where you're playing with the bow a little too hard and bowing a little too slowly. But the effect is that it almost creates like a distortion. And then there's other times where we have them intentionally play out of tune, like on their own individual players just go slightly out of tune every once in a while with randomized.
I caught that a bit in I think Ardennes was one
yeah.
of them that I caught that where I was like, this sounds very like Clint Mansell, Requiem for a Dream, something slightly off type
yeah.
sound.
Absolutely. And we had the whole orchestra try different techniques like this to just build sort of like a haze and just be imprecise and dirty and just kind of reveal the horror and the reality of war.
I appreciate that a lot because that it's, I meant when a Brotherhood of Heroes started, I was like, oh, this is like a John Williams Olympic March. You have the trumpets coming in, and then it goes into something far less John Williams, like more haunting. and more kind of like, if I don't compare it to John Williams again, like more something what he did with Schindler's List versus what he did with say 1941 or Saving Private Ryan, or
Yeah.
like the big trumpet brass scores, like something more beautiful yet just haunting and sorrowful as you go through.
Yeah, and that was very intentional, because the other signature sound, so we have this Haze of War idea, but the other signature sound that I have is what I would call the memory of war. And that's how the piece begins. Like, you hear this blare of horns and trumpets that are playing arrhythmically, but it's like, almost imagine a room full of players, each doing, their own, horn call, trumpet call, or whatever. And it all just kind of gets blurred and into this mishmash. And the idea I had behind that was I wanted to reflect the fact, well, two things. One, the idea that the memory of war is an important concept in the story of the game, because Daniels, the protagonist, has an older brother, and his older brother was a war hero, and that's part of the reason why he enlists, to live up to his memory. But the other part of it is that if you just kind of consider, it's almost like a breaking the fourth wall a little bit. Like, we're making a game about this historical conflict that actually happened. So it's almost like we're embracing this memory as well. We're like kind of invoking the memory. But then intentionally, only seconds after it's playing this sort of cluster of fanfares, it immediately busts into the Haze of War idea with those that kind of air raid siren type sound, and then it just kind of gets more dissonant, and then bang, you're now into the reality of war, where you have this somber cello and all of the kind of different musique concrète ideas kind of adding to this sort of soup of dissonance and grit and realism.
I think one track that really, I think, captured that for me, at least, that like the tragedy side of war, was I think it's called Berga, where it sounded, that's like where I got very much like the Schindler's List theme feel, where it's just like, this is, it's heartbreaking. World War
Yeah.
II, while we try to make it, like a lot of the time musically we make it, heroic, we focus on heroes, we have, we have whole movies about heroes and so on. While this track kind of focused, or seemed like musically it was more on, yeah, but this is also sad. This is, people are dying, people are gone, and they're, this is not necessarily a heroic thing. It's sad that all these people are doing this, and the music seems to reflect that a lot. And I appreciate that.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's, in place of, I won't spoil where it's used in the game, but I mean, the game is out now, and people can kind of put two and two together even if they haven't played the game. But this is one of the final pieces that I wrote for the game, but also one of the earliest pieces that I was conceiving. Before I even got the gig, I had, I knew it would be a World War II game, and I just thought, well, there's got to be some tragedy in this. And so I was sketching out ideas on paper about, like, well, how would I convey that tragedy, but in a very respectful kind of way? Like, how would I do it in a way that would reach people, but not be over the top, not get in the way of the emotional connection? And I always came back to this very simple idea of, like, very clear, what's called an arpeggio, which is where you just have one chord, but you play each note individually, like I have on the piano in this track. And when I've gotten around to actually writing the piece, I literally kind of just hit record and just played that same, it's like a D minor arpeggio. I just played it for about 3 minutes, with kind of rising in intensity and coming down, and having some very simple thoughts about where the harmonies would go. But literally, it's just me playing these 3 notes over and over. And then after that, I added, the harmony and then the melody. But it's weird. It's almost like a very simplistic construction, but intentionally simplistic in a way that I thought would connect with people the best. Like, I could write an over the top or very melodic or very, hey, look how great I am as a composer. Yeah, I could have written something like that, but it just didn't seem very appropriate. It seemed like stripping things down as much as possible to get that direct connection was the way to go. And what's interesting about Burga is that, now that I'm thinking about it, this is the only piece in the entire game that doesn't have any of those aforementioned signature sounds that I mentioned. Like, it doesn't have any of that Haze of War stuff. It doesn't have any Memory of War brass. And it doesn't really have any of the principal themes. It's sort of like a moment of like an extreme honesty that I thought that particular level really deserved and needed. I needed to kind of step out of the picture, not try any composerly stuff, and just be as raw and simple as possible. And so that's actually where the Burga idea came from. It wasn't even really, I wouldn't say that I was influenced by Schindler's List or any John Williams pieces, because again, Schindler's List is a fantastic score, but it kind of is a little bit more historical, and so he had the space to elaborate on his themes and orchestrations and be a little bit more ornate and complicated and sort of musically interesting. Whereas, I mean, this is, not only is this a video game, but it's a first-person video game, so you are the one walking through this horrific sight, and you can't, it doesn't really work to have that sort of grandiose orchestration for a moment like this. It has to almost be as simple as possible and have that sort of first-person scoring idea behind it. So yeah, that's sort of where I was coming from with this Burga track.
And one thing that I've become increasingly fascinating with, I think recently with Jason Graves, the Dead Space composer, is how different composers confront action cues. Because with him, he likes to get under your skin. There's like an extra layer that you don't quite know is there, but it is there, and it like makes your gives you goosebumps and so on. But with yours, I noticed with Duty First, it's an example of, at least feels musically, an example of tension, where you have lots of different layers, and at different times, different layers will be focused on, raised in the mix. It kind of gets your pulse going. So how did you confront action in this game? What was your technique for emphasizing action in different aspects of war?
Yeah, that was actually one of the more difficult components to the score, is the action music. And the reason why is because, I mean, I just mentioned that, yeah, we have this track, like these pieces like Burga, where it's going all out on the respect and the very focused simplicity. But then it's like, well, we are making a video game. It has to, my job is to make the game more fun than if I didn't exist, if you know what I mean. And so, yeah, it was very difficult to figure out, well, how can we convey these same ideas, but still have, the pulse pounding action that, obviously a Call of Duty game needs. And so there are a couple of ideas. In Duty First, this is a little bit different because this piece came a little bit later, but most of the pieces, the way that I got that was with very straightforward ideas and very focused orchestration. And often I'll use solo strings, like in Marigny and in Paris and in a couple of the other action cues. No Mission Too Difficult. And like the way I would use them is, even within the action cue, they would be the ones doing a lot of the kind of rhythmic, these driving staccatos and these, like, they would give the pulse where you normally would expect, something percussive or maybe even like synthesizer type sounds especially for a Call of Duty game, you might expect that. But because we didn't really think that would be appropriate for this game, we used solo strings in order to fulfill the rhythmic requirements that we needed for these pieces. In Duty First, that piece was kind of interesting in that it's sort of two halves, right? Like the first half, it's more about the themes and, giving this sort of very desperate kind of vibe to the main themes that we have going on. But then in the second half, it's almost like a countdown. And so I just sort of had this building kind of 6/4 tension that just kind of keeps going and going and getting bigger and bigger until the very end. was tricky to pull off because we weren't trying to go for a big bombastic thing. So I had to scale back the percussion that you might normally use for a piece like that. But I think the reason that it works is because the way we recorded the score over in Nashville with the Nashville Scoring Orchestra was we had the strings separate from everything, and so we were actually able to use a few fewer string players than you normally would expect for a score of this kind of size. I think it was like 34 strings total or something like that. And there was much more close microphone. There wasn't a lot of reverb added to it. So like every hit of strings really counts. It's not like a big epic thing where, you kind of push the strings back away from the listener, but instead it's like right in your face, almost like you're right within the orchestra and they're just sawing away. And like that was the key to giving this the kind of drive and intensity that otherwise if it were in a normal quote unquote soundtrack with like typical mixing and lots of reverb and whatnot, it wouldn't really have had that intensity.
So, Call of Duty, as you've mentioned, is a series that's had so many great composers. You've had, Giacchino did it, Hans Zimmer, I've heard, did it.
Yeah.
Jack Wall's done it, Sean Murray, Barton. I believe the last one, there was a woman who
Sarah Schachner.
Sarah Schachner, yeah. It was like, I haven't heard of you before, but this is great. But, there's so many different sounds with Call of Duty, and it's usually bombastic, especially the Hans Zimmer theme for Modern Warfare. There's very bombastic, or Jack Wall did with like almost like techno. It was a lot like the Matrix score, which, also because he used the same singer, so it's kind of, we talked about that with him. But like, did you talk to any of them for ideas for Call of Duty, or did you just wipe the slate clean and go, I'm going to do my own and then see what happens?
Well, I mean, a couple things about that. Number one, when you're doing a game like this, especially a COD game, you're under very strict NDAs. So I couldn't really talk to anyone outside of my immediate team about it. So I couldn't just like shoot Jack an email like, "Hey, what's your idea?" So even if I had wanted to, then I wouldn't have been able to do that. But even still, I mean, everyone kind of has their own way of writing, and I had obviously looked back once again to the original Michael Giacchino World War II scores, but it's none of it really kind of matched what we were trying to do with this game, and so it would have been a little bit of a distraction for me to kind of look at what other composers had done. I mean, like, honestly, and this kind of surprises people, but I didn't have a single piece of reference music for this gig. They never said, "Hey, make it sound like this, make it sound something like this, try something like." I got nothing like that. Because the entire time we wanted to make our own sound for it. We wanted to make sure that whatever we were constructing, every single piece of the score sounded like our game. It sounded like Call of Duty World War II. I mean, you may have noticed that with the exception of Jack Wall with Black Ops, no one ever really gets to keep their gig with Call of Duty. Like, it's a different composer every time. And I think that's very intentional. Because, again, this is, even though the games take about 3 years to make, this is an annualized franchise. And so they're always trying to make sure that each game feels different as possible. And one of the easiest ways to do that, of course, is to just have a different composer for every game. The only exception I can think of being, I think Harry Gregson Williams did the main themes for Modern Warfare 1 and for Advanced Warfare. But otherwise, it's been completely separate composers every time. And I'm pretty sure that this is a very intentional move just to make sure that it's different. So, I mean, yeah, like I didn't necessarily reach out to any of the composers for their advice. I mean, if I were to do so, then I probably would have talked to Sarah, just because Infinite Warfare and World War II are kind of similar in how they have, it's all about your people, your squad, and like it's very centered story. It's not trying to be technically Infinite Warfare goes all around the solar system, but you know what I mean? It's always following just your own group and, trying to build relationships within the group, and like every character kind of matters and is fleshed out and all that. Whereas other ones are more about the spectacle and like the larger than life, characters, whereas R2 games are trying to make them a little bit more human. And then World War II, of course, is, taking that a step further and making them not only human, but like extremely vulnerable. And I hadn't really seen that done in any other Call of Duty game, so it just didn't make too much sense to me to look too closely at the other scores.
I know with Call of Duty, there's multiple studios working on it, so that's how they can do it yearly. How early did they bring you in to do the score?
That's kind of a funny question. Like, I was in meetings with the audio director, Dave Swenson, about a year and a half, well, more than a year and a half before the release of the game, but I didn't really get hired properly to start working until I would say late January of this year. And then we only had until about mid to end of July. So it was about 6 months for me to do the score. It's like a 2-hour score. It's a good deal shorter time frame than we would have liked. But I mean, for various reasons, that's just kind of how the pieces fell. We just had to kind of take what we had and get moving as quickly as possible.
At least they gave you 6 months, because I've heard some that get like 10 days.
Yeah, well, I mean,
for 10 days.
that's not typical for a video game. That often happens in film, again, for various reasons that are not ideal.
They edit and so on. Yeah, they aren't locked.
Yeah. I mean, in film, like when you hear these horror stories about like, oh no, Michael Giacchino only had like 2.5 weeks to do Star Wars, whatever. It usually is because of either a scheduling mishap with a different composer that was supposed to do it originally, or maybe they, and this happens exceedingly rarely nowadays, but like sometimes a composer will be brought on and they do their thing, but then eventually the director is like, you know what, we want to try something different. It would be too difficult to just keep rebooting with the same composer. It's just not fair to them. So we'll find someone else. That's typically why you see these horror stories about like, oh, this film was only done in like 2-3 weeks, whatever. But that rarely happens in games. I've never heard of that happening in a game. Like the only time I've heard of a composer being replaced, quote unquote, is when the entire game was just rebooted. So it's like not really, it just doesn't really happen quite as much for video game titles. I mean, games are generally a larger commitment than films, for various reasons. And, there can be a lot more music, and you have to worry about the implementation and like all of these different things. And it's not a linear locked picture. And oftentimes the music is a lot more involved as well.
Yeah, and then you have to do how to loop it, right? Because they could be fighting for 30 minutes.
Yeah.
The song has to sound good enough to last for 30 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah, there's certain things that just don't quite work in a game score that you could easily do in a film score. So yeah, we usually get a more generous amount of time than films.
So we're gonna switch gears just a little bit so we can cover lots of other things, but we'll probably come back to Call of Duty in a little bit. So one listener wants to know, you talk about how you're influenced by early classic Japanese game soundtracks. Are there specific soundtracks that you've been influenced by? Are these like, one person asked, is this like a Koji Hondo Ocarina of Time, or is it earlier than that?
It's around that same time period. I was very much a PlayStation gamer through and through. Like I never had a game console until high school. And then I saw some commercials for Final Fantasy VII on TV. And this is the exact moment where I was like, yes, this is what I want to do. This looks, super awesome, because they're advertising a video game almost as if it's a movie. And that was kind of almost the very first time that this whole cinematic presentation thing happened for a video game. And I would say that's part of Sony's DNA. Like that's just been their thing, quote unquote, for the entirety of PlayStation, is this idea of like this convergence of different media. We can get, like a video game and have it give this sort of cinematic feel. I mean, like you see something like Uncharted and you think, oh yeah, Sony's doing a movie thing now. Except if you think about it, they've actually been doing that the whole time. That's always been in their DNA. That's always been what they're about, is trying to bridge that gap between games and film. I think that's probably why they invested so heavily in 3D, because they were just trying to say, well, what can we do to sort of move the industry forward, with respect to obviously the classic, 2D genres, but also to, try something new and a little different. And so, yeah, it was a lot of those, especially a company called Squaresoft, which nowadays is called Square Enix.
Yeah, so Nobu, you were a fan of Nobu Uematsu.
Yeah, Nobuo Uematsu was his Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy VI scores, especially. Those were the ones that kind of basically told me, yes, this is what you want to do, this whole video game music thing. But as far as actual specific influence in how I write music, I would say that Yasunori Mitsuda, who did Chrono Trigger, Chrono Cross, and Xenogears in that time period, those were the scores that gave me tons of influence at first. Hitoshi Sakimoto, who did Final Fantasy Tactics, and one of my favorite scores ever was Vagrant Story. And I would say that Vagrant Story, you can almost say that, like, I spent my entire career trying to do Vagrant Story and never quite met it. But, like, that's been one of, by far, the most influential scores for me. And then afterwards, in the PlayStation 2 era, I would say Shadow of the Colossus.
That's a beautiful score.
Oh, absolutely, by Ko Otani. And he, that was just an incredible inspiration for just how I viewed this idea of like a multi-layered orchestra where you have, the players are kind of doing their thing, the actual people, but then very subtly you can have these elements that might be from somewhere else. They may be electronic, they may be synth, they may be samples, but manipulated in certain ways. And it never really, like, if you were to tell someone, hey, yeah, Shadow of the Colossus is a hybrid score, they wouldn't believe you. They would be like, no, it's a traditional orchestra. But, of course, they're wrong. It's doing tons of electronic manipulation, and it always has this sort of second layer to things, which I love. I mean, that's where that whole Haze of War concept kind of comes from. It's just an extension of this idea that, the orchestra can be multi-layered and can incorporate very subtly these other elements that seamlessly blend, not necessarily in like a cinematic Hollywood style, like, hey, here's my synthesizers, and they're doing their like kind of matrix synthesizer, Juno reactor, whatever thing. And then the orchestra is also doing its thing, and they're kind of almost fighting each other. But instead, just a seamless blend of the non-orchestral elements with the orchestra, so that you almost don't even notice that it's there. I absolutely loved that. And then finally, this is kind of a more recent influence, but Yoko Kanno, she mostly does anime scores, but she has done a few game scores as well, and they're absolutely fantastic. And I'm just in love with how she deals with melody and harmony, and every score she does sounds completely different, which I also appreciate. Just the unbelievable amounts of variety and diversity in how she writes, and she'll seamlessly blend genres in really creative ways that I think is just fantastic. You might be listening to a piece and it sounds like it's orchestral, but then suddenly it'll bring in some like, acoustic kind of guitar, and then you have some synthesizer blips going on, and it kind of turns into a ballad, and then it goes back into like a jazz thing, all within the space of like 2 minutes. And you wouldn't think that would make sense from how I'm describing it, but if you were to listen to that piece, you wouldn't even really tell when it changed. It just kind of very seamlessly kind of floats around these different genres. And I just think that's genius. I just think that's one of the coolest, and I just find her to be one of the most interesting composers out there.
And, for people who don't recognize the name, Cowboy Bebop, Record of Lotus War, Ghost in the Shell, Escaflowne, that's her. She's done a lot of fantastic stuff.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So, as I did mention earlier, when I mentioned your name to some other Star Wars composers that we've had on, because, when I look at Star Wars The Old Republic, I've had Mark Gritsky on, I've Peter McConnell on, I've had Jesse Harlan on multiple times. So I'm working through that giant collection, and you're the fourth one. I think however we had four of them who've done it, but they've all said how great you are. Let's just say
Oh.
that I will toot your horn. But they said how great you are and how fantastic it was to work with you. And I know one of the main songs that people want to hear your contribution to the Old Republic, since it's kind of like everyone put stuff together, was the Mandalorian Blockade. And I remember hearing a story from actually Grisky and Harlan both said that, you know, when you guys were coming up with the score for the Old Republic, so many people came up with themes, and they were trying to hard really decide who gets the main theme. And I believe Grisky got the main theme, Harlan got one of the expansion themes. What was it like putting together all the music for a game that is so massive like the Old Republic, and then trying to make it all A, cohesive, and B, still yourself?
I think that the answer to that is that we didn't. Like, here's the thing about the Old Republic. There were 5 of us, right? You know, it was Lenny Moore, Mark Risky, Gordy Hab, Jesse and myself. And we each were kind of doing the John Williams thing, but like our own interpretation of it. And I think that because it's an MMO, and so you go to all these different planets, and the way that Jesse and Mark kind of organized it, Mark was the lead and Jesse was kind of the supervisor. They organized it such that Mark was doing all of the principal themes and the character themes, and then amongst the other 4 of us, we did the planet music, and I think actually Mark did a few planets as well, but everyone would kind of get their own planet. And that worked really well because it's like, okay, yes, everyone's sort of doing their own thing, except now that's great because each planet has its own sort of flavor to it. So, I mean, for example, I did Hoth and Tython and Terrace and Tatooine and Nar Shaddaa and Belsavis and I probably some others. But like the idea was that in a lot of my music, and some people on YouTube, I noticed in the comments when they posted it, they kind of caught onto this right away, especially in Hoth. It has this sort of like a loneliness to it.
Yes, that's exactly how I put it. It's very lonely and cold.
Yeah, and Hoth and Tython especially kind of had that feel, and somewhat Taurus as well. Honestly, that was just how I wrote back then. It just had this sort of very, kind of man against wild, and you don't know what's going on. I think these are like starter planets too, if I'm not mistaken. So it's like you're not super powered when you're in Tython, but you're just kind of like a Padawan, and this whole world is out there, and it's just you. So it's like, well, good luck, kid. Here you go, and Hoth as well. But then you go to somewhere like Hata, which I believe Gordy wrote, or Korriban, which I'm pretty sure Mark wrote, and they have completely different feel. Where it's sort of like, let's get in Hata, it's got this like grossness and this nastiness to it, and then Korriban, it's like it has that classic Star Wars thing where the evil people like love the fact that they're evil. They like have so much fun with it. And, that's the kind of flavor that they bring to it. So yeah, I mean, my being on this project, it was kind of an afterthought almost. If I'm going to be very honest, like I wasn't really supposed to write for this game at all. Cause I was just working as a, music editor at LucasArts. And multiple people told me, hey, yeah, you're not going to write a single note of music on this job, just FYI. And I was like, okay, sure. I still, love what I do and, appreciate the opportunity to work in AAA and learn, what there is to learn about it. But then I actually overheard, I think it was Jesse and our boss, Dara O'Farrell, were talking about, oh crap, we have so little time and we need like 7 hours of music. We need to find another composer. And they're throwing out some names. And I just thought, well, I'm right here and, my music is free. You're already paying me. So, screw it. So I just went home that day and, I wrote a demo piece and brought it in the next day and showed Jesse. And I was like, I can write music, FYI. And he was like, oh, you can write music. It's like, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell you. And so, originally I was only assigned like 20 minutes or something of kind of only sample based, very, kind of B tier level music, sort of like ambient stuff and not terribly important, um, relatively important things for the score. But as time went on, I just got more and more assignments because again the clock was ticking, and other composers didn't want to have to just rush through things, super quickly. I mean, they still had to because again we had a ludicrously small amount of time to score this game, but things would kind of fall into my lap, and I'd just be like, yeah, sure, I'll do it, because it was an amazing opportunity, and that's how I got to write for the full orchestra. It was the first time I got to write for live orchestra and choir. And it was also, with that whole main theme thing, that was, literally one day, I think Dara just showed up and said, hey, Fireware is not super happy with a main theme that Mark had already written. So can you just give me a bunch of options? I don't just whatever, just have Will do something, whatever, just everyone, all hands on deck. And so I think for some reason I was on a plane when I got that email or something like that. And so, yeah, I sketched it out on paper while on the airplane, and I just kind of had at it and turned it in, and they were like, cool, yeah, we'll use this for something. They ended up recording it, and yeah, that's kind of the story of it.
So had you done music for The Force Unleashed, the additional music, before the Old Republic, or was it after or during?
I
know the Old Republic took forever to do. It was a long process for that game.
So. Oh no, it really wasn't though.
The composing part was rushed, but I know the game was like.
Oh yeah, the game was been going on almost the entire time that I was at LucasArts. Well, the first time I ever wrote anything for LucasArts was actually in the DLC of the first Force Unleashed.
The Sith one?
No, the first Force Unleashed.
Yeah, well, the first, that was 2.
Yeah, the first. So, okay, now I remember. So we did 2 DLCs for Force Unleashed 1. The first was the Jedi Temple, and there wasn't any new music for that. But the second was Tatooine and Hoth, I guess? Yeah.
That sounds right.
Yeah, Tatooine and Hoth. And in Tatooine, you fight Boba Fett, and I did a boss theme for Boba Fett, and then you fight Obi-Wan after that. And in Hoth, I did actually a bunch of ambient music for that one, if I remember correctly. And I think you fight Luke at the end. Yeah, you fight Luke, and maybe he's the only boss of Hoth. I don't remember exactly, but that was the first thing I did. But I feel like, honestly, I don't know if that was before or after I did. It's kind of a mismatch because Force Unleashed 2, Monkey Island 2, and Old Republic were all kind of at the same time. They all overlapped in weird, different ways. And which, in a way, kind of sucked because, I would, when I was working on Monkey Island stuff, we worked with the Singapore studio, which meant that I had to be in the office, at 1 or 2 a.m. But then the Force Unleashed stuff, I had to liaise with our team. And then, I think Old Republic, I was still writing, once we'd recorded the live orchestra, I still was getting assignments to do more planet music. And so I would have to write that at some point too. So I would almost have 3 work days in one, showing up at 9 or 10 and not going home until 2 or 3 a.m. because I'm, doing Monkey Island stuff at the very end and then Old Republic somewhere in the middle. So yeah, there was a weird time where everything kind of overlapped, but I couldn't tell you exactly when I did what.
So one thing that people are really curious about, since we're we're at a time where Star Wars games are controversial anyway, no matter what happens. But you got to work on, Star Wars: The Old Republic, The Force Unleashed, and do all the Star Wars music, and then you were handed Star Wars: First Assault. Like we had, Jesse did 1313, and he showed us some of the music for that one. They handed you First Assault, they're working on it, and then LucasArts gone. Well, mostly gone, technically gone. What was it like to have a Star Wars game handed to you? You're working on it, and then the game just disappears.
Yeah, that was not ideal. I mean, so just to give a little context, I had worked on First Assault for about 2 years, and I wasn't just the composer. I was, also the music supervisor for that one. It was entirely, my project. Up to me to decide not only, what should the music sound like, and I'm also writing the music and supervising it and implementing it, but also I developed a whole interactive music system for the game. It was a first-person shooter, competitive multiplayer only, and the challenge was, okay, well, this is a genre dominated by games like, Call of Duty, where it's really important that players can hear each other. They need to be able to hear sound design for competitive advantage. But it's also Star Wars, so it's like, how do you mitigate that? I mean, you can't just have a Star Wars game with no music, because that'll just, it just doesn't really feel like Star Wars. But at the same time, you have to make sure that you're not getting in the way. So how do you sort of balance that? And I came up with a combination of scripted music calls, things like, okay, yeah, the round is beginning, and we'll play some music here, and it can be as big and whatever as it needs to be, because every round began with this sort of cinematic dropship intro where you're just flying into the level. You can see exactly how the level is laid out and what your objectives are. There's like holographic call outs showing exactly where you were. And then the level begins. And then from that point on, it went into the AI driven system that I created, where it's looking at exactly the situation that you're finding yourself in as a player. And also it's looking at your actions as a player. And it's adding to this sort of counter and this whole sort of mathematic system that decides exactly not only what to play, but when to play it. And it was a beautiful system, honestly, because you couldn't really predict when music would come in, but when it did, it always felt right. It always felt like I was secretly scoring. I would have level designers come to my office and say, like, Will, I was playing a play test, and I was the last person alive on my team, and I was like hiding in some vents, and I was like scared to death, and then this music came in, and it's like, how did it know? How did you detect that I was in this vent? And the answer was, I have no idea. It just everything kind of just worked in this way based on the different parameters that we had set up. So yeah, I mean, I was very proud of our team. I mean, it was a younger team. The way that it worked out was that 1313 was sort of the premier project. So they got basically all the money, all the senior staff. There were like, maybe 2 or 3 times as many people working on that game as on ours. But ours was like a younger and more driven and more kind of like, we were like the Mighty Ducks of game development almost. And, we just rallied together, man. We had an amazing project lead, Tim Longo, who now is the franchise director of Halo, and Jeff Morris, who is easily the best producer I've ever worked with. And, we treated it like it was a team. We all knew each other. We challenged each other. We didn't just let things go, but, we had that sort of almost indie dev team kind of spirit where it was like, we have to prove ourselves, and we have to, not just rest on our laurels, but let's really do it. Let's do the best we possibly can. I had the score recorded at the London Symphony Orchestra at Abbey Road. So obviously I thought it sounded fantastic. I mean, their performances were just out of this world. And, all in all, we basically finished the game. I mean, a lot of people say, oh yeah, we finished, such and such, and then they canceled. But no, we were actually on schedule about a month or 2 from certification to Microsoft for the download Xbox Live title. You could basically say that the only real things that were left were just some bug fixing, and that kind of thing. And, then we, of course, had the fateful meeting with, Kathleen Kennedy taking all of LucasArts in a room and saying, hey, sorry, there's no easy way to say this, but, the studio is being shut down. And yeah, I mean, it's devastating, it's never easy to have something that you worked for so long, so hard on, just kind of get yanked away from you. I wish I could say that that's the only time that's happened, but on Dead Islands 2, the same thing basically, and that was also heartbreaking because it was like right after it was like my second game as a freelancer after Lara Croft, only like I would say a year or two removed from First Assault getting shut down. It's just like, well, here's this. And it's basically like, all right, don't try for any of this AAA stuff because it'll just get yanked away from you by like the fate or the cosmos or whatever. But
did any of those the technology you created for First Assault, do you still use that, or did that belong to LucasArts? And then that music, all those resources, did they just all like disappear, or did they let DICE touch them? It seems a waste to finish something and then like none of it gets to be touched again.
Yeah, isn't it? I mean, yeah, the music, it's just in a bin somewhere, and the music technology, unfortunately, I'm pretty sure is as well. I mean, it's pretty heavily tied to the Unreal Engine, so it wouldn't really be terribly. And this is like Unreal 3 as well, so there really isn't
Frostbite.
Yeah, there really isn't any way that they could have taken that. I mean, they could have resurrected the idea behind it, but again, DICE does their own thing. And that's kind of all there was to it.
Okay, so we are almost out of time. So before we wrap, I'm going to ask you one more question that we like to ask a lot of people. So we know when it comes to video games, there's the NDAs. You're probably working on stuff now that we won't see for years or a year, and you can't talk about it anyway. But is there anything that you can talk about, the type of people that you're working on, or appearances, or just where people can find your music? Because we know when it comes to video games, a lot of it's never released for people to get legally, like CD wise and so on. So where can people find your music? And what can you talk about that you're working on right now? If it's just World War II, we'll talk World War II.
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously COD World War II, but also the project that I'm actively working on now is called Anew: The Distant Light. And it's one of the most exciting things that I've ever worked on, and probably the most personal score that I've ever done. It's an indie game, and it's a 2.5D Metroidvania style thing set on an alien asteroid. And what's unique about this game for me is that it's got one of the most unusual art styles that I've ever seen in a game. And it's incredibly evocative. The idea behind the art is that, yeah, you're happening upon this world. I won't go too much into the story, but like you're an Earthling, a human, whatever, and you're sent there for a specific reason. But I don't think that anyone from Earth realized that actually this, this planetoid is already settled by, this advanced alien civilization. And that's sort of the twist, is that it looks weird and it looks crazy, and you see all this very almost like psychedelic kind of architecture, but everything makes sense. Like everything kind of makes sense in a certain way. In Earth, everything that we do is kind of based on the rectangle. Like you look at your monitor, that's a rectangle. Your building that you live in, that's a rectangle. But in this world, this civilization is all about the triangle, and specifically it's the fractal triangle, aka the Sierpinski gasket. And that's sort of like the design motif that kind of carries over to so many different aspects of this world, and it has this it's foreign, but it kind of makes sense on its own, which almost is terrifying in a certain way. And we wanted to do something like that with the music. And so the answer was, when I start a project, and if I get reference tracks or whatever, what is it usually? It's like, oh yeah, do something that sounds like this Hans Zimmer thing, or like Born Identity, or whatever. Well, in this game, my reference tracks were all 20th century art music. It was things like Bartok and
Wow.
Schoenberg. It was John Adams and these very complicated but very heavily nuanced modernist compositions. And also Jerry Goldsmith's Planet of the Apes. So very, very challenging music. And so I tried to kind of bring that and add a little bit more of like 1960s style synthesizer into it, to kind of get a unique and otherworldly sound that's very complex and weird, especially harmonically, but it all kind of just makes sense when you put it all together. And so, yeah, I mean, this is one of the most challenging, but easily the most personal and I think unique scores that I've ever worked on.
Sounds definitely like one I want to hear. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
I look forward to that one coming out. Didn't you also, I have a brother-in-law who's a video game composer himself, and usually he'd send in questions, but he's finishing up his degree right now. So, but you helped found Impact Soundworks, right? Which gives, it's just like you can buy sample libraries and so on from there for composers.
Yeah. Yeah, I founded it. Yeah.
Are you still involved in Impact and so on?
Very little. I mean, about halfway through LucasArts, I realized that I just don't have the time to keep up with it. I mean, the way it worked was I founded the company, and then later on, I brought in Andrew Aversa. And the way we worked it out initially was that we just said, all right, well, everything that, if only one of us works on it, then, you know, they should take all of the royalties from that. And if both of us work on it, then we split it and so on and so forth. But it got to a point where it was like, I just didn't have time to work on anything. And so all I was really doing was paying taxes on stuff that I didn't actually get any money from. So it was like, all right, you know, I gotta, you know, kind of cash out. And so, I kind of remained as an advisor, and they come to me every once in a while for stuff. And I still obviously collect royalties on the stuff that I worked on, but, I haven't really been able to do too much. The last thing I did was the Slavic choir, Vocalisa. But other than that, yeah, I've not really been able to keep up too much with it, just because the music composition thing was, kind of took up a little too much of my time.
Yeah, you've done composition, you've done master classes, you've, you know, taught, you know, you lectured at, you know, you've done lectures on game music, so you've kept it very busy, and I look forward to hearing definitely the new soundtrack, because that sounds, I love music, and it sounds like something that I'd really, really enjoy. Do you have any other appearances coming up, like at a convention or a class or anything like that, that people can go meet you or anything like that? Or is that
Sure. I mean, unofficially, because I'm not a guest of the show, but I will be at MagFest, Music and Gaming Festival in DC in early January. And I go to Game Developers Conference as well. I'm lecturing about Call of Duty this year. At GDC. It'll be in sometime, I think, in March.
Yeah.
And then I believe in April, I'm also going back to the SF Conservatory once again. And yeah.
One last quick question, since, you know, gamers know this week is a big week. There's the Game Awards tomorrow, and there's PSX this weekend. Are you excited for that as a gamer or a person who's worked on games yourself?
Yeah, well, you know what? So I'm actually... I can't believe that I turned into one of those guys because I have so little time to play games, but I'm turned into a big Bloodborne Dark Souls fan. Like a big Bloodborne and Dark Souls fan. Like, it's actually kind of a problem. And so nobody's heard from From Software in quite a while, so I'm looking forward to PSX quite a bit, because there are rumors about, you know, maybe they're going to remaster something, or yeah, we're keeping our fingers crossed, but I'm going to be giddy like a schoolgirl on, I guess, in this weekend when PSX happens.
We all know the entire video game world would explode if that sixth game that they said they're going to announce at Video Game Awards is going to be an Elder Scrolls game. So the whole world, if it is, we don't know what it is. They just said it's a sixth game of a famed franchise. But if that happens, the world will explode.
Yeah.
Gamers tend to do that. But this is fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. And if people want to follow you online, where should they go?
Yeah, you can go to my Twitter. It's just at Wilbert Roget. And yeah.
Fantastic. And of course, your website is rogetmusic.com?
Yeah, rogetmusic.com.
rogetmusic.com. And there's a lot of great stuff there. But thank you so much. And congratulations on a fresh and good sounding World War II score. And as I said, a rather tired sound. But you made it work. You made it work really well.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Very impressive. But have a good rest of your day, and I look forward to hearing more of your work in the near and distant future.
Cool. All right, man. Take care.